What's going on, world? Welcome to my podcast. It's just different with Ty, where I talk about social and political issues, you name it, everything under the sun. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment section below. Hit the notification bell so you get updated on the latest newest videos. I have with me again my brother, Mr. Ike.
Welcome to It's Just Different with your host, Ty.
How you doing today, this evening, sir?
Very good. Nice to see you again, Ty. You
Always
could
a
drop the
pleasure.
mister, but I appreciate
You know, and listen. It's always a pleasure having you on. Like I said, we had a great conversation before about the pieces you wrote on Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and everything else, and I totally appreciate you for that. And then we definitely said we were going to get back together and do something else. And even after this, we're going to do some more things in the future, man, because you have so much wealth of knowledge that, and I totally respect you. And it's just all this information needs to come out, and I feel you the guy to do it. So again, appreciate you for coming on my platform. I thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for those kind words.
Yes. All right. So now let's get into it. We're gonna get straight into it. October 7th, 2023, as the world knows what happened. Hamas bombed and killed, I believe, over 100 people and 100 Israelis, right?
The figure that they're giving now is 1,200 civilians.
Wow.
Originally, they said 1,400. They reduced it to 1,200 dead, and then there's another 100 or so hostages that came about in the aftermath of the Hamas attacks. Yeah.
Yes. So again, this is for me, and I'm always gonna be honest. Like I told you before, I really don't know a lot about. Of course, I know between the feud that's been going on, for a long time. I've never really done real research, but I know you have. And I know if anyone's, is spot on and knowledgeable about this situation, is definitely you. So this is why I have you on here, so you could talk about it. So please, you have the floor. Let us know what led up to those attacks and other things of that nature, and everything that's transpiring going on from that, please, sir.
Well, I'm glad we're starting with what's going on today, because October 7th is now over 2 months ago, and the initial the horror of October 7th for most of those 1,200. I'm pretty confident in the documentation, although some people have challenged it, were unarmed civilians that were consciously targeted, not only Israeli Jews, but other workers from other countries that work in Israel, including some Israeli Arabs. 21%, I think, of the Israeli population is Palestinian Arab. We can talk about that. That's a very important part of the whole history.
Talk about that.
But contextualizing what happened, and a lot of since then, and now it's December 22nd, what is it here? I got my watch here.
Yeah, 21st.
And the number of unarmed Palestinian civilians has now gone from those initial 1,200 unarmed Israeli civilians that were targeted by Hamas, which is in the political control of the Gaza, which we'll get to, Gaza, West Bank, how that happened, the various history that led up to this horrific situation. But just sticking with the numbers and now it's first 5, 10, 15, 20-fold more, including some 8,000 children. And the documentation coming from Gaza health authorities has not really been challenged, other than saying, oh, it's from the Gaza health authorities, but, which they say is Hamas. But at the same time, they've provided pictures, names of children, videos, and other organizations that are independent of the Palestinian organizations have backed it. And all the major news organizations in the world, including the New York Times, which employs dozens and dozens of fact checkers to give them credibility, overall. They may lie on big things, but they tell the truth about a lot of factual things and employ people to make sure they don't screw up, have accepted those figures. So something like 15 to 20,000 unarmed Palestinian civilians that have died as a result of the really ferocious counter assault by Israel, which is not some isolated incident. Hamas, and we can get into the history for various reasons, ended up in political control of Gaza, which is a small strip which has practically been flattened by Israeli bombings by now, inhabited by 2.4 million Palestinians, of whom they estimate some 1.4 million have been displaced from their homes, and so on. Because Israel, it was very clear after the October 7th attack, anybody that knew the history knew that the Israelis were going to counterattack and attack ferociously. I'm certain among the people that knew that, especially that knew that, was probably the Hamas leadership. But in any case, whatever people intended or didn't intend, the consequences of October 7th and since, both the intended and the unintended consequences, I think, are going to reshape the region and the world, and are shaking up and roiling world politics. And we're going to have to see what happens. Israel is trying to continue with what it says is its military objective of absolutely crushing and pulverizing Hamas, which may still have thousands of fighters, people that are trained in combat or whatever, that they are going to go after. So we'll have to see. At the same time, the United States, other powers in the world on a great scale, much higher than mine, are very worried that this could turn into a regional war, that Israel has clearly lost the public relations campaign. Whatever sympathy they could have and should have gotten, in terms of, as Fidel Castro said, you never should harm a civilian. If your military tactics are aimed not at military targets, although some claim, Israel is a highly militarized society, because of, from their point of view, the threat that they fight. Everybody, men and women, are join the army, except some of the ultra Orthodox religious Jews that sit around and study and pray all day. And even some of them have joined now, because within Israel, after October 7th, there was a tremendous, you can imagine, war fervor and bloodlust. And we're seeing that play out. So this is a history that's rooted in, horrible displacement of peoples and murder and genocide in Europe coming to the Middle East, a whole history which we can go into. But I'll just pause there because we're dealing with the current situation. And I also wanted to say that when I was on your show before, which I enjoyed thoroughly, and we had a good rapport, I thought, and I was also speaking specifically as a leader and activist in the New York, New Jersey Cuba Sea Coalition and U.S. Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition, and in my but I'm speaking here tonight. These are just my personal views. The organizations that I help organize, and I'm active in promoting our Cuba Center. There's a range of views on the Gaza, Palestine, Israel issue, the nature of Hamas, and so on within our organization. We try to not ignore those, but to sublimate those, because we want to focus on ending the U.S. war against Cuba. So I thought I needed to say that, Ty,
Thank you.
But we can go on into the history if you like.
Thank you. Thank you. No, 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 no. Perfectly fine. Real quick, you have sort of a personal connection to this. So can you explain, please?
Well, the personal connection is that I'm Jewish, born and raised in America. I'm a Sephardic Jew, which is a minority among Jewish people in the United States and in the Western world. That is, most Jews are what they call Ashkenazi. That is, they migrated from Europe after the Spanish Inquisition and so on. The Jews that remained in the Middle East, which were overwhelmingly Muslim lands, although they were colonized from the 18th century on, and that's another important aspect of the whole story, is the decolonization of the Middle East as one of the consequences, and the decolonization of Africa eventually, and Asia and Latin America is one of the consequences of World War II. Well, for the Jews of anyway, Sephardic Jews were the ones that stayed in the Muslims. So my family immigrated from Syria at around the turn of the 19th or 20th century. So I have a personal stake. I grew up Jewish, although I was one of the few Sephardic Jews. My parents spoke Arabic, but unfortunately, they never taught it to me. I wish they had them. It's a beautiful language. But, so I have that personal connection. I understand what anti-Jewish prejudice is. I also understand what that issue and the question of that I couldn't help but grow up with it. Like being Jewish, you grow up, and if you're my age, you grew up a lot with Hitler and the consequences of that. The European Jewish population before World War II and the Holocaust was 9 million people. It was reduced to 3 million people, and the 6 million that died in the most horrific industrial extermination manners. They were not the only ones. The Nazis killed 10, 20 million or more, but 6 million Jews, which other than gay men, and were targeted, communists and others that were exterminated, and any blacks that they could have got a hold of, but there weren't that many in Europe. Certainly Hitler was the #1 white supremacist. Kanye West don't seem to get it, but any black person would. But anyway, so that was a traumatic experience growing up, and naturally, and when the first war that I experienced growing up was the 1967 war, I would have been 16 years old. And naturally, everybody in the Jewish community was worried that little Israel, which was this refuge for people fleeing anti-Semitism and all that stuff, was going to be wiped out. So I actually went to Israel at that time, and on an all expenses paid trip, because I was already radicalizing. And at that time, the Israeli government and Zionist movements were trying to counter the anti-Zionist sentiment that was developing on the campuses as part of the radicalization around the Vietnam War, the Black Rights upsurge. So I was one of those people that was radicalizing. I went to Israel. I became very disillusioned. This was 2 years after the 1967 Six-Day War. I saw the first Palestinian refugee camps. We drove through them. I met with Israelis that had fought in the 1948 war, but I became disillusioned. I kept being told, well, the Palestinian refugees, which I was already conscious of the horrible plight of the Palestinian refugees after 1948 and when the state of Israel was established, and the so-called Nakba, which was when the 600,000 or 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were pretty violently, in most cases, expelled, or through intimidation, radio broadcasts saying, what happened in this village where hundreds were slaughtered, will happen in yours if you don't flee. This is all documented. The village was called Dir Yasen. So anyway, and it was war, and war is hell, as we know. And, these Palestinian Arabs that had lived there were displaced, expelled. Their lands were taken over by, and this is the great irony here, many of the Jews that were displaced by Hitler and the Holocaust, were not allowed to come to the United States or Western Europe or the countries or the lands that they would have had originated in or were more acclimated to, spoke those languages, whatever. But were sort of in, not necessarily coerced, but here was Palestine that was promoted. And at that time, the British rule over Palestine was disintegrating, as British colonial rule was, even though they won the war. They were being displaced by the United States, by U.S. imperialism everywhere. Same thing with the French in Algeria, and the Soviet Union came out of World War II as a superpower, and all of them were jockeying in this situation to win the favor of what existed in Palestine at that time, which was this Zionist community, settler community, that had built an infrastructure, that had built industries and developed. And then after the war, you had all these hundreds of thousands of raggedy, wretched Jews, survivors of the camps, that were sent to Israel, where they were happy to go anywhere. And a war breaks out, and this became and out of this war, I mean, I'm truncating this history, but out of this war came the Palestinian refugee crisis, which has continued to be a crisis in the entire Arab world, a cause championed sometimes falsely and dishonestly by some reactionary and even some secular Arab regimes. But at the same time, this continues. There were several wars, 56, 67. Out of the 67 war, Israel occupied what had previously been administered by Jordan and Sinai and Egypt, which Egypt eventually got back, and Golan Heights, which Syria still contests, which is still occupied by Israel. But the West Bank and Gaza, where a large bulk of the Palestinian population that was not, citizens of Israel, the 21% that I mentioned earlier, were concentrated in terrible living conditions. That was where the revolutionary organizations in the 60s and 70s grew, and in the refugee camps, the Palestine Liberation Organization. But out of that 67 war, there were these occupied territories. These are still the occupied territories today, although West Bank is administered by the Palestinian Authority, which is very discredited among many Palestinians, and Gaza, which is also very discredited among many Palestinians, but has also emerged. So you have a divided Palestinian movement, and the two-state theory, the two-state solution, which diplomatically has been on the table for umpteen million years. Nobody has moved on. Everybody gives lip service to it. Perhaps, if and when the dust is settled, there may be some initiatives towards that, but we don't know. Right now, we need to stop the bombing and the combined military operations, which would have to be, of course, mutually stopped, and massive humanitarian aid has to be sent to Gaza. And this is the imperative.
Hmm. So there's two things that I want to talk about. I had two other questions, and then when you gave more information, that kind of changed. There's other questions that I wanted to talk about. Was kind of, yeah, I would say it is personal. And again, you came on here, and I think you're saying that you're coming on here
I
as
try
you.
to be objective. It's personal, but I have to say that. But after I came back from Israel, sort of disillusioned, I said I got to study this. And I discovered some things, studying the history, reading all sides, trying to be objective. Um, I discovered that contrary to the mythology that the Palestinian refugees were really the responsibility of the Arab states because they didn't absorb them like Israel absorbed many Sephardic Jews, actually hundreds of thousands, that left the Arab world in the context of the uh, turmoil, decolonization from Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and went to Israel. So that never they festered in the camp. So I sort of bought that line that this is the Arabs' fault. It's not Israel, because the Israeli propaganda would say, well, if the Palestinians ever rose up against the Arab regimes that oppressed them, like King Hussein in Jordan, um, or later, well, that example, then which is exactly what the Palestinians did the September 1970 when I returned from Israel. And instead of siding with the Palestinians that King Hussein was massacring, um, at the time, Israel sided with King Hussein. So that's when I decided to wash my hands of that and sympathize more with the Palestinians. But the Palestinians right now, it's a very difficult situation because you have this terrible crisis, what I would call as a Marxist, a crisis of revolutionary leadership. Oppression, misery, exploitation is not enough for mass revolt and for revolution. It's part of the tinderbox that gets set on fire. It's part of the steam that the engine releases. But if you don't have a leadership, or a revolutionary or liberationist leadership that can compress that steam, that can lead it programmatically, politically, tactically, militarily, if necessary. What are people like Mandela and the ANC in South Africa, like what Malcolm X would have been in the 60s Black Liberation Movement, which is why they murdered him, like Fidel in Cuba and Che and those fighters, like the FLN in Algeria, like the Vietnamese, the Viet Minh and the NLF in Vietnam, like the MPLA in Angola. You have to have that. And this is a problem with like I said earlier, you have the Palestinian Authority ruling in West Bank in cahoots with Israel. They can't step out of line. They won't take the type of initiatives politically that could be taken, because the thing about Israel, and this war shows this to me more than ever, which is why I think, and this is again my own opinion, I think the Hamas attacks should not be prettified as some kind of mass uprising of the people or of this great resistance with Iran and Islamic Jihad and with money from Qatar that Israel, by the way, winked its eyes and let it come in. We can get to that, what Israel's relationship with Hamas has been over the years. Let's try to remember to come back to that. But in terms of well, I sort of lost my train of thought. That's what happens when you get old. But anyway, go ahead, rescue me, Ty.
Okay, cool. Did you want to? You said you want to talk about that later, but did you want to talk about that now, or did you want to? Because I had two questions, but if you want to talk about that now, as far as the relationship between Israel and Hamas over the years, you wanted to dive into that now, or wait later?
Well, it's contradictory, like lots of things in the Middle East, and with Gaza, Palestine, Israel. I don't like to say they're complicated because that becomes a cliche, and a lot of times there's some things that has to be done is very simple. like stop the bombing, stop the killing. That's not complicated, but it's highly contradictory. There's many historical and human narratives coming up against each other, and the kind of revolutionary leadership that's needed sorely in this situation. But Israel in the 1970s, 80s, certainly the 1960s, when the Palestine Liberation Organization became the united front for the Palestinian struggle, that united different tendencies, that came forward politically with a program that was independent of the old Egyptian-dominated Palestinian liberation organizations. They came out with the slogan of a democratic, secular Palestine, where all what Palestinians, Jews, Christians, and Muslims could live together in a secular state, which was a big advance. Over the years, diplomatically, moving fast forwarding some of the history, but at that time, the PLO and the Palestinian Liberation Movement, which was a secular movement, was seen by the Israeli governments, whether they were Labor or then later mostly Likud and Netanyahu, as the bigger threat than what they saw as religiously led, theological, Islamist movements that they thought would just sit around and pray all day, and they certainly would not become they actually promoted in secret, manipulative, covert, but documented ways the Hamas against the PLO. And when the PLO, through military action by Israel, was driven out of Lebanon, driven into Tunisia, and then after the first Iraq War, there was a lot of divisions and all kinds of things that we can get into at some other point. But essentially, there was a lot of diplomatic motion towards what was labeled two-state, which would have been more or less based on a UN Security Council resolution that was passed unanimously, including by the United States, shortly after the Six-Day War, which is still in effect, ignored, of course, and now the United States vetoes anything that's even mildly critical or calling for a ceasefire. They're wrangling right now as we speak. There's big negotiations going on in the UN right now as we speak over the wording of a resolution, because the United States does not want to keep vetoing resolutions that call for an end to the violence. It's just and they know it. They know how isolated they are. So this is a big political problem. But getting back to Hamas and Israel. So that's one side of things. But Hamas also has roots going back to a lot of what's often called Islamist movements, the Muslim Brotherhood, that goes back to the 1920s and 30s, when there were all kinds of different tendencies and movements in the rising Arab world, nationalist tendencies, people that wanted to throw off the yoke of the British and the French and so on. And with Hamas, so those roots are more reactionary, the more conservative elements. There were also more progressive, revolutionary elements that were influenced by Marxism and socialism and labor movements and so on. That's part of that history. But since 1967, these territories have been occupied. There was motion towards what was called two-state and UN 242. This has been ignored by Israel. They keep building more settlements. The conditions in places like Gaza and West Bank, like I said, they fluctuate from worse to much worse, and it's that's how it's been. There was uprisings called intifadas. The first one set in motion a lot of diplomatic activity. The second one sort of degenerated into suicide bombings. A lot of the Palestinian, and this was the emergence of Hamas. They lost a lot of the moral high ground on that. Israel was able to garner some sympathy, and in any case, the Second Intifada was pretty much crushed. And a lot of the best leaders, like Marwan Barghouti and others, had been in jail for 25 years ever since. Some people say he could be the Palestinian Nelson Mandela. I don't know, but that's the situation. Maybe out of this, and one of the ironies of history, we don't know. Depending on what happens, if Israel is able to continue its military campaign with the U.S. flashing yellow light, or if that yellow light turns to green, turns to red, or if they continue on. I don't know if the politics of that's going to work out too well for Uncle Sam, but we will see. But maybe in one of the ironies of history, we will, there will be some motion, I hope, towards some pressure towards Israeli concessions that can advance an independent, sovereign, contiguous Palestinian state. And then over time, a different dynamic can set in motion where people learn to work together. This is the only way forward, because, there's a lot of violence and hatred that are built up, and this is and vengeance is wanted. I think Barack Obama, who I don't usually cite politically, but he made a comment the other day where he said, Israel has to worry that every innocent Palestinian civilian that they kill, they're creating new generations that are full of desire for revenge. And the only way, I think, to break this, and there's many Israelis that feel that even though the military relationship of forces is a joke between Israel and Hamas or the Islamic Jihad, they fire off thousands of missiles that are very gruesome. Some occasionally kill somebody, but are basically pipsqueak things compared to the high-tech firepower that Israel has supplied by the United States. If you have a tank, that's I've seen pictures of these huge tanks, behemoths, that are pointed at some high-rise apartment building. And Israel will say, hey, there's a Hamas command center in there. And maybe there is. But if you blow up the whole building and there's 100 families in there because Hamas has a so-called forces in there, it's still a war crime. You're not supposed to be able to do that. It's like Hiroshima, by today's standards. And, anyway, I'll stop there on this subject.
You keep, oh man, you see, every time I'm about to ask you a question, you answer it. And I was just going to ask about the United States supplying Israel with this, with all these weapons of mass destruction, and you just talked about it.
Well, there's more to say about that, because the United States supplies Israel with at least $3-4 billion a year in military aid.
Say that again. Say that again. I'm sorry. Say that again, please.
3 to 4 billion. The last number I remember for sure accurate several years ago was 3.1 billion. I'm sure it's more by now. And they're rushing things in now that Israelis need to restock: munitions, smart bombs, high-tech sonar devices, and all this kind of crap, but murderous stuff. So, but yeah, the Middle East is very important strategically for U.S. power being projected around the world. Some of the most important shipping lanes are there. The competition, what they call geopolitically. So Israel has always been, it went through different alliances, believe it or not. In the earliest years of Israel in 1948, the main supplier of arms to Israel and the closest political allies, the first allies and supporters of Israel in the United States, was the Soviet Union. Most of the arms were from Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, and Israel fought in the 1948 war. I think Stalin thought that Israel, because they were fighting British imperial control, would be possibly an alliance. This is the same Stalin at the time that was beginning anti-Jewish purges in the Soviet Union. So this is the craziness of history. So, but Israel quickly changed its alliance and was more oriented toward the French and the British. Not so much the U.S. until after 1967. The 1956 war was a fiasco for Israel. They aligned themselves with France, and Britain invaded the Suez Canal, which Nasser had nationalized. And they were forced out, actually, by the U.S. and the Soviet Union working together, Eisenhower and Khrushchev, to force the Israelis out, which they were very bitter, which also shows that when they need to, the United States will pull the plug on Israel if they had to. At the time of the 2003 Gulf War, which George H.W. Bush was in the leadership of at the time, they consciously kept from the Israelis stuff that they could have used to shoot down Iraqi missiles, which they've subsequently given to Israel. But at that time, because the U.S. was very concerned about the alliance that it was forging against Saddam Hussein with all these Arab regimes that it's also allied to besides Israel. So the United States walks a tight rope, and the United States is taking huge political hits now by its support of Biden to Netanyahu, who he's embracing. So these are big problems for the United States, but they are definitely gearing up towards and are trying to prevent, I think, a expansion of the war to involve Iran. But at the same time, they're sending the U.S. naval fleet in the area. It's an extremely volatile situation. And perhaps Hamas hoped that out of the October 7th, that you would have this kind of a geopolitical crisis that would up the stakes. I don't know what their thinking was, but I do know another fact I'll throw out to your listeners, which is that 2 months ago now, or 3 months ago, several weeks before the October 7th attack, the Israeli government was racked with division. They were on the verge of falling. There were mass demonstrations in the street and so on. That's all now evaporated. You have this bloodlust in Israel. So far, the support for Netanyahu's war drive seems to me to be pretty rock solid, with some few courageous exceptions.
So going back to the two personal questions I have for you, and I wanted to ask as a Jewish man of the Jewish faith, right?
Well, I don't have much faith religiously, but I consider myself Jewish in terms of identification or something.
Okay, so identifying, right? Identifying. Okay, so when you hear, or when people say, again, it's probably a personal question, but when people say, Palestine, that's our land, and you talked about it a little bit, but I just want to dig deeper in it and get a clear answer that that's our land. And you hear them, you hear some people say, Jewish people should get off our land and whatever have you. Do you agree with that? What is your take on that?
Well,
Again,
my take on it is that it's that's part of the contradictory. Yes, there was continuity of an indigenous Palestinian presence in what is now Israel going back many, many centuries. There's a lesser but also real Jewish religious continuity in that land also. But the Zionist movement, which began in the late 19th century, was a secular political movement, not a religious movement. And they began to plant settlements in land that was not unpopulated, but relatively sparsely populated. They kicked the indigenous fellahin, peasants, off the land, bought it from rich absentee landlords, from foundations that were funded by people like the Rothschild banking family and something like that. But there were also idealistic young Jewish people that went, and they were going to have the pioneer spirit and settler colonial spirit and go land without people for a people without land and blah blah blah, which was nonsense. But but um, but anyway, so this enterprise continued. The Zionist movement, they had a movement, they had world congresses. They had many different wings of it, including a lot of people that called themselves socialist and blah, blah, blah. But, they weren't extremely popular or even very popular among the Jewish masses of Europe at the time. At the time, most working class Jews and Jews as a people, and this is a heavy subject that we can get into in terms of how nationalities get formed and the Jews of Europe.
Break it down. Break it down.
All of that. But the Jews underwent tremendous social and class transformations under the battering ram of developing capitalism in the 19th and even the 20th century. So there developed a Jewish working class, a Jewish proletariat that actually developed very revolutionary and socialist ideas. And I would say most working class Jews were more inclined in a socialist and revolutionary direction, especially those living under dictatorships like the Tsarist dictatorship in Russia or some of the various dictatorships led by Jew haters and pogromists in a lot of the Eastern European countries, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. So life was very precarious for many of these Jews, and they had no choice but to struggle, and many of them chose to struggle through their unions, through alliances with the broader revolutionary movement, and so on. They tended to be very anti-imperialist, very anti-racist, and so on. Many of them were forced to emigrate to places like South Africa, where they became part of the revolutionary movement against apartheid, and so on and so forth. But for our purposes, the most important thing is that these Jews that came to developed into the Zionist movement were very unpopular. They were not unpopular necessarily, but they were not what the majority of Jews were in Europe at that time, where their political energies were focused. Now, all of that changed with the rise of Hitler. Hitler conquered power in January 1933. By 1939 and the onset of World War II, many Jews had been forced to flee Nazi Germany, the expansion of the Nazis in countries like Europe and the Sudetenland, and then the Polish invasion. All of these countries were populated heavily by Jews, and all of them were targeted when the big apple of Operation Barbarossa and the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, where millions of Jews lived, and where Hitler, in his propaganda against Jews, painted Jewish Bolshevism. He amalgamated. So Jews were identified, like right-wing caricatures of Jews. This is sort of the beauty from the point of view of propaganda of anti-Jewish prejudice, which is that the Jews could be labeled all as rich bankers on the one hand and all as communists on the other hand. So it's sort of crazy. But anyway, so those populations eventually were the ones that were slaughtered in the death camps. So that was the end of that period, and those Jews that survived it undoubtedly were subjectively happy to be able to go to Palestine or anywhere. But the other side of that is that they reinforced a movement, and that had every intention, and we now have documents that show this, that had every intention of using the opportunity to displace the entire Palestinian population. And in any case, that is what happened to a large extent, as I've already discussed, through violent means. And the aftermath of that is still happening 75, 80 years later. So there you go.
Okay.
But in answer to your question, yes, it is their land. If I can, I have a quote from Malcolm X that I wanted to use that I got out of the autobiography. And I tell you, I think Malcolm, like he often does, sums up so much, the dilemmas of it. He has a whole rap. It's on page 277, 278 of the autobiography. There's a whole rap about Jews in Germany, where he talks about the Jews in Germany. They were so assimilated into German society, they couldn't believe that this was happening to them. And he gives a fabulous rap on that. But then he gets to the point where he starts talking about Israel, and he says, most mysterious is how did those Jews, with all of their brilliant minds, with all of their power in every aspect of Germany's affairs, how did those Jews stand almost as if mesmerized, watching something which did not spring upon them overnight, but which was gradually developed, a monstrous plan for their own murder? And he italicizes murder. Their self-brainwashing had been so complete that not long after, in the gas chambers, a lot of them were still gasping. It can't be true. If Hitler had conquered the world as he meant to, that is a shuddery thought for every Jew alive today. The Jew will forget that lesson. Jewish intelligence eyes watch every neo-Nazi organization. Right after the war, the Jews' Haganah, that was the Israeli army, mediating body, stepped up the long-time negotiations with the British. But this time the Stern Gang, which was one of the Zionist, actually very terrorist organizations, was shooting the British. And this time the British acquiesced and helped them to wrest Palestine away from the Arabs, the rightful owners, and then the Jews set up Israel, their own country, the one thing that every race of man in the world respects and understands. That's a pretty heavy quote. And I mean, assuming Alex Haley transcribed it accurately, I think that shows Malcolm's grasping of the contradiction there.
Wow. So when you hear things, right, when we looking at news, Western news, media, whether it's Fox, CNN, whatever, you hear them. I want to know what do you think your reasoning for this is when you hear them speak? Most of the time when they cover this story, what's going on right now between the Palestinians,
Sure.
and the Jews, right? When we see this, they tend to lean to more of pro-Israel,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
Anti-Palestine.
Sure.
But and again, you came here as yourself, but you've been involved in so many different organizations, and and usually in the grassroots community, different organizations, there seems to be more of a commitment, more of a loyalty in a sense to Palestine, in the movement. So I wanted to know, why do you think the reason for that? When you got Western media, they're pro-Israel, but within the community.
Very good, excellent question. I would say that most people that are getting politicized by this, just seeing the horror of it, and seeing the obvious bias of the U.S. media, probably are open to the idea that's spread by a lot of people, sort of a conspiracy theory, that it's because the Israelis or the Jews control the media. This is one of the tropes of anti-Jewish prejudice that people can raise. The reason that these people give a pro-Israeli bias, more or less, is because they are promoting what the U.S. government which is itself divided and fractious, I would say probably the protests around the world, that something has shifted. I think that you probably, I don't watch much. I have to tell you, I gave up watching cable news a long time ago. I think probably it stopped getting interesting for me when Bernie Sanders dropped out of the race in 2020 or whatever it was. Because they were sort of forced to cover things differently a little bit as long as he was a contender. But I can't really stomach it. I can only imagine what they're saying now based on what they've always said. And certainly, but they're promoting what the U.S. government interests are as they see it. And that has historically been, as we said, they give them $3-4 billion of aid a year. They have this strategic alliance that's gone on for many, many decades. At times, like I said, they reel Israel in. Right now, they got them on a very long leash, and they're paying the big price. We'll see what happens, but it would be a mistake to conflate Israel's interests and U.S. interests necessarily. Right now, the U.S., I think, is pressuring Israel to what they say, reduce the casualties. It's all BS. They keep pouring the munitions in, but this is their public posture. So to get back to your question, the media is the media. It's like Malcolm said. They got you loving your friend and hating your enemy, and they got you turning the victim into the criminal. Now, people don't buy it as much. People see the images. People see it's the very longevity. People that have any conscience of the Palestinian struggle without buying into any anti-Jewish prejudice or being anti anything. They just, they just see the images. They see some of the history, and they see, I think, how long it has gone on. Israeli propagandists can put, oh, why do you single out Israel? There's people dying all over the place. You got how many hundreds of thousands dying here? And why do you picking on little Israel? It's because it's the Jews. It's the Jews, because you hate the Jews. No, it's part of, for many people, for some people it's that, but for many people, it's because it's gone on for so long. It's been an injustice for so long. 60 years since those territories were occupied. We need to have an independent, sovereign, contiguous Palestinian state, and then let it exist next to Israel. Over time, let the Palestinians and the Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs will be a big part of that mix. Let them learn to live together peacefully and work together and develop alliances across religious lines and along class lines. And then we will start to see a new day in the Middle East.
Okay. Thank you for answering that. Because I always, when I look at TV, which unlike you, I do watch a lot because I like to see what's going on. Whether if I agree with it or not, I always see that where it's, one side is saying this, one side is saying that.
I think that's correct. I read mostly what the other side thinks more than what I think. But I try to read more now. My routine now is I gave up on cable TV, on all of that stuff, Morning Joe. I used to watch all that stuff. I look back and I say to myself, oh my God, what I do now is I get up in the morning. Of course, I'm retired. I get up in the morning. I make my nice healthy breakfast, and I read about 7 or 8 newspapers online. Not all of them, of course. I skim what I want to read. I just keep up that way. And I have a lot of news sites that I go to, and I can get also a lot of podcasts like yours and others and learn things that way. I don't think that, to me, that there you're getting clearly the old saying that attributed to this great left-wing journalist named A.J. Liebling, where he says, freedom of the press is for those who own the press. And when you get to the cable and the big, I mean, they own the New York Times too, but you can learn how to read between the truth. I think wouldn't you say, Ty, that it's very much harder to get a revolutionary point of view on mainstream media?
Absolutely. I would know. We could go. That's a whole nother topic. We can go on how I feel about that and what I feel what they're doing to hinder my process on here. But the truth is that we got to get the truth out there, and with people like you on here. Again, I appreciate that. Now let's flip this question real quick, because you said earlier that at that time, and it's probably more now, the United States was giving Israel $3 or $4 billion a year, right?
Right.
Now, as far as Palestine goes, are they receiving any aid from any other country, China or something, or anything like that to that aspect, or anything,
Well, basically, sort of like Cuba at the UN, they all give a lot of verbal support, sometimes very inspiring words. China has spoken out very eloquently for two-state solution, as has Cuba, even more so, as has Vietnam. As far as material, this is part of the irony of the situation. If you look, I mean, even as the United States is sending all these billions in military aid, and basically a blank check to restock when they blow shit up and they run out, and they run out of apartment buildings, or they run out of bombs. They ship them in, but they also are the ones usually that they've been funding all these refugee camps all these years through the UN Human Rights Agency. They allow a lot of Palestinians who are now in the streets marching for their self-determination into the U.S. as citizens and students. And then, they get angry when they take advantage of the freedoms they're supposed to have here to tell their side of the story, But like, again, as Malcolm said, democracy means hypocrisy when it comes to America. But anyway, they're learning one good thing about America, which is that you take the space that you're strong enough to take, whether it's in the streets or in the public debate, and that's what we're doing now. We want to that this debate is happening. I think things have changed, and hopefully, as I said, out of this will come some motion towards self-determination for Palestine.
In the end, that sounds what everybody would want, but how realistically can that really happen, where
Sure.
both sides say, okay, we're gonna come to a happy medium and we're gonna no longer bomb each other again? Because it sounds good, but it seems it is good, right? And that's best for both parties. But will there ever be, do you think, in our lifetime, where they stop feuding and warring?
Well, I'll get to that, but I think the most important thing is to figure out what happens next.
What happens next? Go ahead.
I'm quite a devotee lately in my old age. I like to read a lot of, believe it or not, operational military history, especially World War II. I like to get into a lot of the details of the battles, because if you look at history, what really accelerates history, and that means history is really concentrated politics, or politics is concentrated history, both, is war. War and revolution, more than anything else, really speeds up what's sort of festering anyway, objectively. So I think in the case of the current situation, this is a real war. So looking at it that way, I would say that it depends. Right now, Israel, it's very clear. They don't really care. They're not thinking about anything except crushing Hamas. How will they do that? They cannot. Right now, they have pretty much leveled northern Gaza. The Palestinians have been forced, and whatever Hamas fighters are still surviving have been forced southward. And right now, they just sent Austin, Secretary of Defense Austin, to Israel. You know, there you can imagine the discussions if you could be a fly on the wall about what they're going to do next. The Israelis want to resume as big as they can to complete the military operation, which to them is to completely pulverize Hamas, no matter how many civilian casualties happens. And if the logic of that is that they can convince the Egyptians, which are resisting it, to let Hamas, they'll say temporarily, into Egypt, which is where Gaza borders, and which Egypt is very anti-Hamas and basically has collaborated with Israel against Hamas. Hamas is very unpopular in the whole region, although their popularity may have superficially increased after October 7th, just because the Palestinian population is so, battered and looking for any kind of redemption or whatever. But at the same time, there's still a lot. But in the region as a whole, among all these different Arab regimes, with the exception of Iran, with the exception of Hezbollah in South Africa and South Lebanon, or in Lebanon, and in Islamic Jihad, which is allied to them in Gaza, and with money that up until recently was allowed into Gaza through Qatar with Israeli collusion for all these years. Israel felt clearly before October 7th that they had pretty much dealt with the Palestinians, that it was no longer an issue. They were expanding their diplomatic relations all over the world, their economy, which is very high tech and highly advanced. You'd be amazed at the kind of brands that they produce. They've normalized their relations. They have normal relations with China, with Vietnam, and so on. All of that now, after October 7th, they got complacent. They thought, well, they defeated the Palestinians, the last intifada. They got all the leadership in jail. Hamas is, they can have their little enclave. We'd rather have them run it than some democratic secular Palestinian movement that would challenge us effectively. And so they got complacent. And then all of a sudden, there's 1,200 dead Israeli civilians. And many of the Israeli population, not to say that they're sympathetic to the Palestinians. I wish I could say that they were, except for a few courageous people. But they are furious at the Netanyahu government, which they weren't too crazy about anyway. So a lot of things. A year from now, Ty, if we're talking about this again, I think you're going to have a lot of different players, and what the Israelis most fear right now, and what they fear, is that pressure is going to come from their best ally, which is the United States, because this is where we're at right now. They fear the pressure that the U.S. will do to them now what they did in '56 when they were about to take over Egypt, with that they will force them to back off. And if that happens,
how would the U.S. force them to back off, or just so you can,
Oh, well, they can pretty much give them an ultimatum that if you do not accommodate our demands very specifically and concretely, then we will not veto the UN resolution, make that binding in terms of international law. They could even abstain on it, which would still make it binding, because it would still be the majority. They could cut off supplies. They could have a vote in Congress. There's all kinds of things they could do. I mean, Israel is independent of the United States, but it's also dependent on the United States. It's also a client of the United States, although it has its own interests. Most of the time, those interests coincide with Washington, but sometimes they diverge. And that's been also part of the history. So this is one of those moments right now where, in the broader context, where Washington is very worried about the aftermath of the Ukraine-Russia war. It hasn't exactly gone the way they were hoping. They're worried about China's relative rise. They got all kinds of worries. It's not easy being the number one power in the world. You gotta worry about that all the time to maintain your position, especially when economically you're not dominant like you used to be. Financially, you're not totally dominant like you used to be. Militarily, you may be completely dominant. There's no other power in the world that has its Navy covering every inch of the world's water surface and its Air Force covering every inch of the air surface of the world, with 120 military bases around the world. They have that dominant military power, but in certain areas of the world, like the South China Sea, they're worried about competition from China. There's all kinds of factors that they have to take into consideration, and they really are not in a position to be taking these kind of political hits around Palestine and Israel, when Israel has clearly lost the political relations war. That's what Austin is trying to tell him. That's what Biden is trying to tell him in his incoherent way. He's saying, you guys, you're gonna, and Obama was trying to warn him, but they are determined to do this. This is how they've always reacted. You hit us, we'll come back 10 times. That's the ethos that is now gripping, I think, the society. I don't think it's permanent, and I don't think that I'm not saying that it can't be overcome, but the conditions which it can overcome and change, because there was a time back in the 80s and 90s when the Israeli governments were forced to make some significant concessions. Instead of directly occupying the West Bank, they granted it some kind of autonomy. There was supposed to be the Camp David, which fell apart, and then since then, but there have been times when the Israeli population has been, when they saw that there was a chance to live in peace, that they would be willing to make concessions, I think significant. If they're forced to by the United States, I think they will have to accommodate themselves to that, because the ones that are thinking have to know that all the best propaganda in the world, and they're very good at propaganda and presenting their case, and they have a lot of allies, as you said, in the mainstream media and the spin and the major newspapers. But I do think that around the world, it would be even greater if to the degree that the Palestinians are identified with Hamas, and that, of course, helps Israel, because you cannot, the South Africans under the ANC and Mandela, and the Afrikaners had even less of a claim. They didn't have the Holocaust that they were running to South Africa. That's a little different history. But the ANC did not target Afrikaner or British, so-called white civilians. They did military targets. And if a civilian was killed, oh my God, they put out these statements about how sorry they were, that wasn't what they meant. I mean, Hamas is organized around a different, and politically their program is, they're a religious outfit. They believe in, they're very anti-gay. They don't allow trade unions. They rule Hamas, the West Bank. But, for many Palestinian youth, The alternative to Hamas is if it's the Palestinian Authority. I mean, that makes the choice of Trump versus Biden look good, So what are you going to do? This is the crisis of leadership. But this is another. I'm confident that one of the consequences, unintended consequences of out of this war, will be motion towards resolving that crisis of leadership.
Hmm. So, all right, thanks for clearing that. Because when I asked you about it will force them automatically, I just ran to, oh, so they're gonna say, hey, listen, if you don't do that now, we're gonna go to war with y'all. That's what I thought. But you broke it down, as far as I guess sanctions and other different things that they might or treaties or whatever that they have that can, I don't want to say cripple them, but stop, stop their economic growth and things that they want to do, to that nature. Now, is there any other? I've heard, and I don't know if you heard that there in Israel, right? There is a group. I'm not sure of the name. I'm going to ask and see if you heard about it. A group of Jewish people in Israel right now, that are advocating for Palestinians. I don't know if you heard. I heard that from somewhere. I don't know if you heard about that. If you did, what's your
No,
take on that?
there is a there have been over the years many Jewish organizations and individuals. There's a group called Peace Now. There's groups that are very courageous that go monitor Israeli activities and that resist draft resistors. There's always been an active peace movement, and but like, as I said a few times already, right now the mood in Israel, maybe it's cracking a little bit now under the current pressure, and as they see the isolation and maybe these forces, which are also, they're relatively dormant, because it's like, it would have been like right after 9/11, if you had tried to organize a demonstration against the Afghan war that they were getting ready to launch, and you carried Bin Laden signs, you wouldn't have gotten very far.
Right.
So like today in Israel, I think a lot of them are laying low, but they do have networks, they have magazines, they have newspapers. This is one of the contradictions again within Israel. Israel is an advanced capitalist economy with a very fractious and contentious parliamentary democracy, which is also origins as a colonial settler state with an advanced industrial economy. Those are all part of the contradictions. Some of these people I see, they say, from the river to the sea, and we're going to get every inch and this and that. I mean, they're I think more than anything registering their frustrations and their anger at the horrors of the slaughterhouse going on in Gaza right now. But the only possible way forward, and I think this is why the diplomacy of revolutionary Cuba advocates this, is for two states in the interim, for the Palestinians under whatever auspices and leadership. I mean, I do think, going back to your earlier question, that Hamas may seem to have temporarily gained popularity. I think that's maybe half a mile wide and a millimeter deep. But I think that Hamas will be finished not only as a military force, but as a political force in the next period. I might be wrong, and the thing could expand into a regional war, despite the efforts of everybody that's wringing their hands about it now. Iran is could be a factor in the situation. I'm sure there's a lot of pressure coming down on them from some of their allies, that like Russia and China, that don't want to. There's a lot of what they call geopolitical things of all the different players involved here. I mean, I'm a Marxist and I'm consider myself a socialist. So where my starting point is what's in the interest of the working people in that region of whatever religion, nationality, or creed, and that has to include the Jews that live in Israel now, because they are there. There is another factor that we really haven't even talked about at all tonight. Maybe we can come back and do it another time. But the whole question of the rise of anti-Jewish prejudice in the world today, which is probably at its highest level, including in the United States. There's groups that monitor these things. There are more hate crimes directed against Jews these days. There's what they call swatting, where lots of Jewish synagogues and institutions are getting bomb threats that are fake, but that forces them to evacuate their premises.
Yeah. And you're right. That's a video. Sorry to cut you off. That is a video we could do on another. Yes, I would like to cover that.
I mean,
in its whole
I'm
self.
prepared. I had a book I wanted to promote tonight.
Go ahead.
Into
Show me.
all of that, but
Jewish
we'll do
question.
that the next time.
It was great. Oh, sorry. Okay, so hold that book. You know me. Yeah, definitely. Now, you real quick. You was talking about what Cuba wanted to do and what their plan or their idea was for Palestine and Israel. Can you go into that a little bit more? To talk so we because again, I have no knowledge about that.
Yeah, among Palestinians, Cuba is known as their number one friend in the world, always sincere, and have promoted the Palestinian cause forever. And that's true, and that continues to be the case. At the same time, the Cubans have stated, Fidel Castro has stated in the past, and Cuba's always had the diplomatic position of they used to have diplomatic relations, full diplomatic relations with Israel. They currently have reduced relations, not full normalization, but they do have diplomatic exchanges, and have had before the current war some significant targeted commercial trade and no trade sanctions. But so diplomatically, Cuban diplomacy, what I would call revolutionary diplomacy, has always supported two states. They've supported UN 242, which calls for sovereign, independent, contiguous Palestinian state. Contiguous means that Gaza and West Bank are separated geographically, that you would have a corridor or something linking them so that you would have a contiguous, fully sovereign Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. Now, that is a demand that any Israeli government, because they've been building so many settlements and everything, they've resisted that. But that is the just demand that the world community supports and that Cuba supports. If that was realized, that is the road to peace. That is the road to harmony. That is the road to a future democratic, secular, and if I have anything to say about it, if I'm still alive, socialist Middle East. That's in the interest of the working class. But until we get to that glorious day, we have to start with two states living side by side. How will that happen? I think it is going to happen through diplomatic pressure on Israel to make concessions, and a process and a dynamic of discussions with heavy world pressure that has to be enforced. That may be a pipe dream. We'll see. But the alternative is just what it's been for the last 30, 40 years, cycles of violence. Israel is not strong enough, and they won't be this time either, to get rid of the millions of Arabs in the occupied territories, or the 21% of the Palestinian Arabs inside Israel, even if they wanted to. And most of them don't want to, and know that they couldn't even if they did want to. It's not the same world today as it was in 1948. the Jews in 1948 had the sympathy of the world because of what happened to them under the Nazis. So all the nations of the world supported Israel, gave it legal status in the United States, recognized it. And so that sympathy is gone. It's probably long gone. There's major elements of it left in the United States because the United States propaganda and the spreading of it in the United States. It's not the Israeli lobby. It's not that Israel controls the Congress. These are right-wing tropes, anti-Jewish conspiracy theories that a lot of right-wingers promote and a lot of racists promote. But a lot of people buy into it because it's very easy. In America, we don't have any mass working class party. We don't have a mass black revolutionary movement. All of the struggles are subsumed into the Republican and Democratic Party charade. It keeps our minds all messed up, so we can't think straight. So as a result, conspiracy theories fill that vacuum. They're entertaining. There's this one. Even if they're true, they're BS because they create a mentality where you're looking for some trope. There's some explanation. The reason that there's war is because the Jews control the media. The reason that there's unemployment, it's because Mexicans are stealing our jobs. It's the reason that there's crimes. It's because black people have a gene for criminality. There's all kinds of conspiracy theories that engage people that the ruling class promotes so that our minds are all befuddled. Now, among those conspiracy theories, ones involving Jews, us Jews have just been, we get a lot of it because of our unique history, which we can go into back from Middle Ages. This book gives an analysis of that going back to biblical times. It's fascinating history in terms, but it ended up with the horrors of the Holocaust and that situation. I do not think the state of Israel happening the way it did, the Zionist dream of 1903 that they had when they first got together with their schemes, would never have happened except for the particular circumstances in World War II, the Holocaust, and the aftermath. Now, having said that, today, in this volatile capitalist world that we live in, where racism and violence and class polarization and economic crisis and post-COVID and all these crises taking place in the world, Russia, Ukraine 1 month, Israel, Palestine, who knows what's going to be next? You got a nut job in power in Argentina that says he's going to end all the pensions and throw everybody on the streets. So, they're fighting already. He hasn't been in office for a day. It's a as the Ashkenazi Jews say in Yiddish, it's a mashugana world out there, which means crazy, like loco. So, in that context, these conspiracy theories, these prejudices, these tropes gain credibility. So I was saying earlier, there's neo-Nazi organizations in the United States. They have their own newspapers, they have their own websites. Groups like the Southern Poverty Leadership Councils tracks them and so on and so forth. They have a name for the U.S. government. You know what they call it?
What's that?
They call it ZOG. That means Zionist Occupied Government. They are the ones that promote these theories, which unfortunately some people that sympathize with the Palestinians may pick up on to say, well, how is it that Israel is able to get away with massacring all these people? It's because the Jews control the Congress. The Jewish lobby controls the Congress. They say the same thing about Cuba. How is the United States able to cause such suffering on Cuba? It's because of the Miami lobby. It's because of the vote in Florida. This is all nonsense. This is the United States government follows its own interests, its own. If they are ready to throw Israel under the bus, or the Miami Cubans, if they deem it's in their interest to do something different, to shift, they'll do it in a heartbeat. That's one of the ways they got to be the top dog in the world. They're losing that skill now. But anyway.
You think the United States is really losing that skill? I mean, we talked about the military still being strong, but you hear other people say that they're not as, experts and whatever, that they're not as strong as they once were, or they're not even the top on the top tier anymore.
It's uneven. Like I was trying to say before, there's several realms that a superpower has to, if you look at the great empires of the past, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Tsarist Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Hungarian Empire,
the Roman Empire, yeah.
Great kingdoms in Africa. I mean, wherever you want to go with it. One of the things that held them together was financial power, economic power, military power, and political power. The United States came out of World War II dominant in all those fields, because World War II was not fought on U.S. territory. When there's a lot of factors I could go on about this, but the U.S. emerged with the most money in the world, most gold, the best military, with a worldwide span. Its allies, Britain and France, they were allies in victory over the Nazis, but their empires were basically on the way out, and within 10 years were gone, displaced by the U.S., which didn't rule in a direct colonial way, mostly, as the European powers did in Africa or Asia or Latin America or the Middle East. So the U.S. emerged out of World War II totally dominant economically. The U.S. industry dominated everything. U.S. capital, they had so much surplus capital because they stored all the value of the world, because the rest of the world was in turmoil with the war being fought on their territory. Asia, gazillions of people dead. None of that happened in the United States on U.S. territory. So the Soviet Union was completely destroyed, and then immediately was in a Cold War confrontation with the vastly superior United States, and then went on for a long time. Well, that world is pretty much over. U.S. industry is not as dominant. It is in some fields, but not in others. China, other countries have emerged as serious competition. European Union, the dollar is still dominant, but it's under some attack. BRICS and other things, the rise of the Chinese yuan, that's a very touchy thing that often reflects tectonic shifts in relationships of forces around the world and so on. The military power, like I said, it's still dominant. But military power is ultimately, as the great German theorist von Clausewitz, that is the first thing taught in every military academy in the world, is this guy, von Clausewitz. And one of his axioms is, war is the continuation of politics by other means. And what that means is that war and politics is totally interconnected. So the U.S. in this case has this completely powerful, world-spanning, dominant, high-tech military capability that they could project in theory anywhere, anytime. They could push a button somewhere in the Pentagon, and like I told you the last time we talked, 5 bombs could drop on Havana. That's how much military power they have. What restrains it? What constrains it? Politics. The political pressure on them in this country and around the world, on the ruling class that controls the U.S. empire, such as it is in this day and age, through the Democratic and Republican parties, through the U.S. Congress, through the facade of democracy, and so on, where under that facade, the iron fist of capital rules. So in that situation, I forgot the point I was going to make, but there it is.
We was talking about them being on top, and is that really true? Some people say
Well,
they
that's
lost their
different
power
today,
and military.
you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
and perhaps this war, going back to what I said earlier about wars accelerating history and politics, this war is going to have a lot of consequences, foreseen and unforeseen, for the United States government around the world, and also for every other power. Uh,
right.
Around the world. And we'll see what happens. It's going to be very interesting.
I want to touch about a couple more things real quick.
Sure.
You said, and I'm saying this because I have also a friend, one of my best friends, he's a Jewish man. So we had a quick conversation on this, and I wanted to ask you because you actually just brought this up authentically. You talked about, would you be wanting, paraphrasing, the Middle East to be basically like a socialist state in a sense that would probably work for all part of probably the best choice, right? The idea. Can you?
Well, but socialism, it's not something that you can impose because it's a beautiful idea. It has to come organically out of the consciousness of the working people and their self-consciousness that this is the kind of society that they're consciously striving to build. This is what happened in the Cuban Revolution. This is what happened to an extent. It was distorted, but that's another question. In the Chinese Revolution or the Russian Revolution or some of the elements of other genuine revolutionary struggles. But socialism is not something that it's like instant coffee that you could just pour some water on and there it is.
Of course, of course.
It has to come out of struggle. So to me, I'm a socialist, but I talk about as a socialist, I'm more keen on what to do next, how to win this union struggle, how to win this fight against cops that are murdering some unarmed person or killing somebody like Breonna Taylor, or concrete issues. Now, I support a broader program, and if you ask me what my vision is, which the way things are going, I'll probably be long dead before it comes into being, but maybe not.
Maybe
I'm
not, maybe
always
not. Still
optimistic.
here,
Uh,
still
but
here.
my vision would be that, as I said earlier, if you have a different dynamic take place, Jews and a lot of Sephardic, especially Jews and Muslims, they have a lot in common. I mean, their prayers and their rituals are very similar. Their dietary habits. There's a lot of commonality that could set in motion. And in the past, there have been shoots of that between Palestinians and Jews inside Israel that have happened. And there are even today some examples of that. This current war has messed everything up. It's set rage is boiling now everywhere, but that will recede, sooner or later. And once another dynamic sets in, then we can pose more concretely solidarity, and then out of solidarity, common struggles, and out of common struggles, a new consciousness, and out of a new consciousness, to struggle for socialism. But it can't be the other way around.
And I was just saying that if, like you said, as far as socialism, because I wanted to get to this point, so because I want him to hear. So again, he knew more about this than me. I didn't do the research and whatever have you. And you're saying if, like you said, it's not you just pour on and it just happens like that. If the people are willing to accept it and they are in this socialist state. Him and I had this conversation. He said, well, look at historically through anywhere in the world where socialism was enacted, or the people wanted socialism, it never worked out. And
Well,
it
see,
happened, and it's
this
been
is
worse. So
why.
where can you
Yeah.
point to a spot?
Well,
And when you bring that up, that's why I wanted to ask you on
I'll
that.
give you a friend my rap, which is this. His mistake flows from the word enacted. Again, this goes back to what I was saying before. Socialism cannot be enacted. It cannot be imposed. It's not a beautiful idea that you try to impose on the existing capitalist, class divided, ridden, racist society. It has to come from the consciousness of the people that they get through engaging in common struggle. And in history, now, when that happens, to say that socialism failed every time it was tried to be enacted, it's not only false from that point of view, but it's also completely ahistorical, because what has happened with every example by the working class, let's not even call it socialism, let's just call it every example by the working people, the oppressed and exploited nations and classes that have tried to take power and have done so successfully through bloody struggles like Vietnam, like South Africa, like Cuba, like the Paris Commune, like the Russian Revolution. What happened in all of these cases? The existing capitalist world of the oppressors, the existing world of the colonialists and the imperialists and the empire builders and the racists and the slave traders and all of those forces, what did they do? They marshaled all their forces to try to crush that example, just like they're trying to crush Cuba today. That's always been the case. So to talk about socialism has failed, no, it hasn't failed. It has caused the capitalists to go crazy to try to crush it because they don't want the example to succeed. So Cuba was succeeding, and in many ways still succeeds despite the tremendous pressure, with a tremendous example for the world that Africa knows, that Latin America knows, of doctors, of the education system, all of that. That example has to be crushed. And the way you crush it is just by promoting a cynical attitude, which is what US propaganda does all the time. Oh, socialism can't work. Human nature is against it. All these tropes. It's the same kind of tropes like conspiracy theories that, it's just colloquialisms and cliches that have nothing to do with actual struggles. Because really what changes people is their involvement in struggle, and it's the conditions that will lead them to fight and are leading them to fight.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And I'm gonna ask you another question. I know I'm gonna ask you on here going down, but I love hearing you talk and just opening my mind up with information that I didn't know, and also the people that are watching. So going back to Palestine, Israel. Now, do you think, and I asked this again, I asked it before, you answered it, but I just kind of wanted to, put it back in people's minds again, that a truthful, honest solution can come into play where the bombing and whatever have you cease, and they can somehow work out an agreement on, hey, we're both here, this is how we're going to live. Again, it's not going to be perfect, but this is how it's going to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or is this going to continue for another 20 years? What has to happen, again, explaining it, what has to happen for both parties to try to cease this war?
It depends on, what is both parties. On the Israelis want to frame it as them versus Hamas and all the what they call clinically collateral damage, all the dead civilians. That's just unfortunate. The Israeli president, who is different from Netanyahu, says, "My heart breaks at all the dead, all the Palestinian civilians." His heart breaks. It doesn't stop him from his government from dropping the bombs that are killing them, but whatever. So from the Israeli point of view, they want to frame this as a military conflict between Israel and Hamas, and their goal remains to crush Hamas, to pulverize it, to root out every last one of its military cadre, and then they haven't really thought out about what happens next. Who's going to rule in if they succeeded in that, who would rule in the interim in Gaza? Biden has said it can't be Israel that rules. Well, who would rule after if they achieve this, if it's even achievable, so-called military victory? So that's how the Israelis want to view it. The way the United States, the EU, the UN, the G77 led by Cuba, China, Russia, every world power wants to prevent the war from spreading and wants to see if a different dynamic can be imposed. Right now, the obstacle to that happening, which would concretely mean a ceasefire that all sides, for it to have any meaning, would have to honor. So all these pipsqueak missiles that Hamas shoots off to Israel, they have a lot of them, and they make life very annoying. But compared to the high-tech Israeli military, they're nothing. That's why I call them pipsqueak. But they would have to stop. All these other attacks would have to stop. That's the first thing. Now, that's sort of the only obstacle to that happening right now is the U.S. government, because the U.S. government is vetoing the UN Security Council, and the U.S. government continues to give Israel the yellow light to continue its military, combined military actions, and is only saying, bleeding and wringing their hands, please, please cut down on the civilian casualties, and so on and so forth. So that's where we're at right now. So you ask me what could happen, how long it would take, God only knows, and we can discuss that another time. But my point is that we shall see. How is that dynamic going to be broken? I have my speculations, and I'm not going to try to predict anything, but I can foresee that at some point the U.S. is going to have to reel Israel in. And I think Israel is going to fall short of its military objectives, because those military objectives are not exactly clear as to how that could even be implemented. And you can't have a purely military result. There has to be some kind of administration in the Gaza, if there's any people left in it. And meanwhile, the West Bank is getting hot and heavy again. The Israeli settlers in the West Bank, which is where the bulk of the Palestinian population lives, are getting more aggressive and more intimidating, more attacks on West Bank civilians, more settlements being built. All of these pressures are now multiplied by 20 with the current war. So, those are the parameters of what can happen and what will eventually happen, but I can't predict the pace.
Brother Ike, I thank you. I thank you for taking time out your busy schedule, coming on here again, and I promise you we are gonna do another video to the topic you wanted to talk about with the racism or the hate that the Jewish people are receiving in America. We're gonna do that. We're gonna talk about that. And again, appreciate you. Is there any last words you want to say to the people?
Well, just thank you again for having me on. I really enjoy this. I like the back and forth. Thank you for giving me a platform to get out my ideas, and I really enjoy very much this back and forth that we're developing, and it means a lot to me. Thank you.
I'm so happy I met you, man. And again, you're my brother for life. Love you. And again, soon again, we're gonna do this. Until the next time.
We'll talk about it. Maybe
yes,
we can. Okay,
you.
very good. Thanks,
yes, we will. We're gonna talk about it. Thank you.
All right.
Peace.
Bye.